The theme or paradigm of friendship in the context of sexual, spiritual, and therapeutic abuse, in the polarity between abuser and victim, therapeutic practitioner and therapeutic client, the older man, the teacher, and the student, is perhaps a little bit unusual, or certainly not counterintuitive. But it's part of the narrative amidst everything else. And I want to honor that part of the narrative because it's part of the circle. So what does friendship look like? And what is a friend? A friend is someone who challenges you to be your best. A friend is someone who supports you to be at your best. And here we get into the overlap between friend and enemy. If you think of Russia and the United States, would the United States have bothered to put a person on the moon, for those that believe that happened? There is some reasonable speculation. Would we have done it were it not for our enemy? Would the internet be invented? In fact, the word competition, to compete, is to bring out the goodness in the other, to challenge the goodness in the other, that which is substantive, to step forward. And truly so in the mathematics of competition called capitalism. Generally speaking, the person with the strongest numbers or the strongest position ultimately prevails, and everyone learns from them. Meaning in the publishing industry, I think there were well over 100 publishers that rejected J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter. Aren't they regretting it? Significantly less than 1% interest in the most, popular best-selling books of all time. Why? Because they weren't going to sell. It was the same with Lord of the Rings and the Unwin Press. The young Unwin who wrote to his father that owned the printing press, and he said, "Dad, the Lord of the Rings will lose money, guaranteed. However, it is a work of rare literature, and so if I can have your permission to lose money, I think it is the kind of thing that ought to be published." So they published Lord of the Rings, and, it has been a bestseller ever since. And the point is that after Harry Potter, there were hundreds of knockoffs. You can't turn on a fantasy show mostly these days without seeing echoes that are confidently borrowed from one of the best-selling, themed books of all time. And so this is this challenge, and the same has been going on with Tesla Motors. So the healthy aspect of competition to bring out the best in the other is an important part. The other thing that's very important to understand in the tension between enemy and friend is that an enormous amount of it has to do with scale. And the equation works like this. In the phenomena of mass, or the principle of mass, the largest mass, a bowling ball running into a pinball. What happens when a bowling ball hits a pinball is the bowling ball slows down a very, very, very tiny fraction, less than 1%. Absorbs the energy of the pinball. The pinball goes flying, and the bowling ball continues in exactly the same momentum where it began. Now, this kind of phenomena of mass, it has no morals, it has no excellence, no underlying rightness or anything like that. It's just a bigger ball rolling in a certain direction, hitting a smaller ball and sending it flying. And that's the law of momentum. Now, pinballs don't have egos, don't have personalities, etc. So this is not a traumatic event for a pinball. It's moving along, it gets blasted off in some other direction, the bowling ball continues the way it goes, no big deal. When you have a group of people, a government, a company, a family, giant adults, parents, in relationship to a small infant, when you have a large mass in relationship to a small mass as human beings, with egos involved, meaning every ego has a certain sense of its boundaries, of its integration, its integrity, its values, etc. When a large mass blasts an ego off in a disorienting direction like that, without attunement, without kind of partnering, there is the fear of death. This initiates the traumatic sequence in the body, the fight, flight, freeze dynamic. Because when human beings blast into one another like this, this is correlated with a sociopathic level of incompetence. Meaning, we all intuitively know this phenomena of mass. And so we wouldn't really enjoy a boxing match with 5 giant boxers all beating up on a 6-year-old. What do you mean we're going to pay to see that? That's abuse. Get them the fuck out of there. Because it becomes a violation when things are too big in relationship to something that's too small. There's no sport. There's also no competition. There's no chance of bringing out the best in either. You take a world-class tennis player and pair them up with someone hitting the ball for the first time, and both of their games are going to go down. If anything, the beginner will go up in that context, but you actually start to play worse when you're playing with an incompetent tennis player. And so we understand this. And the phenomena is when an ego is inside one of these entities, a company being bowled over by Amazon. Microsoft used to be a particularly good bully in the software industry. Just the threat that they would buy you up and shut you down would freeze up all your customers and stuff, because the odds of surviving a $30 billion war chest, which is what Gates set aside to ensure Microsoft's dominance. You have a dominance paradigm of large masses colluding. When Oracle bought up PeopleSoft and just shut them down because they had a legitimately good product. This is why we have the monopoly breakup phenomena, why Standard Oil was broken up and things like that. Because if something gets too big, it wins not by legitimate merit, but by sheer scale. And this is very important to understand in this particular dynamic between myself and the facilitators, because there's a number of things that tie into the experience and perception of scale. One of them is age regression. When you do work with a therapist who reactivates the parental abuse dynamics, you go back to the smallest age of trauma when that abuse initially occurred. Now, the issue with this is you're no longer viewing the world as a competent adult or even grown-up. You're viewing the world as a 6-year-old, as a 5-year-old, as a 2-year-old in a traumatic abuse contract with your abuser. in which they hold the key to survival, security, love and belonging, and self-esteem, the first four bases of human needs. And so the first thing to understand in kind of the enemy dynamic that is totally predictable for any competent psychologist or psychiatrist in this area is to understand that when you regress someone, you become giants. Just one person becomes a giant, and usually it's holding the contract of the projected abuser. So you've got the first level of scale. So at 2 and 6 years old, we've got 3 to 5 times the mass in relationship. So now when you get into a conflict, it's a life and death conflict to the person in the regressed state. So this is key to understand, for all parties. The other thing is that this wasn't just one therapist abusing me. I reached out to every single facilitator and asked to be held and asked to be listened to at an incredibly traumatic moment, and was rejected and excluded, so that a closed-door meeting with my abuser could take place to decide how to manage this issue as a threat to the Human Awareness Institute's reputation, which of course it is, but it becomes an exponentially bigger threat when you treat it as a threat rather than as an ethical responsibility to care for the abuse survivor of someone you've unilaterally recommended, trained, and chosen, and pointed towards the abuse survivor. Meaning I'd never have met Peter Santil in a million years if high facilitators hadn't chosen him, said, "We think you're up to the job," and then told the whole community, including me, "This is a great guy, come work with him, he can help you, he's amazing, just pay him his fees and good things will happen." And we're not going to go into anything particularly relevant, such as licensing or what exactly we've trained him in, or what his facilitator agreements are exactly. We're not going to go into any of that. Just trust this guy. So it wouldn't have happened without that. And this entire group, having met behind closed doors, decided that a high participant being sexually, psychologically, and spiritually abused under the influence of psychedelics was not a high issue, therefore would not receive high protection, would not receive support, other than to try and influence me to keep it secret and actually sign an abuse contract. So we've got already a 5-to-1 scale differential with Peter Santil, which is enough, meaning if you've been regressed and sexually abused by one therapist under the influence of psychedelics, they can kill you under a variety of circumstances. It depends on the situation, but they can directly see to your death, not even necessarily by chopping you up into bits and pieces, but simply by pulling on the strings of the silent abuse contract that in our culture doesn't get pulled apart. We sign the abuse contract with our parents, abusive mom and dad, what do I have to do to not be killed in this family? Well, you've got to do this and this and this, and don't do this, and say you feel this when you feel this, and don't bring up the fact that Uncle Billy is a rapist, and don't do this, and okay, sign here. And then, by the way, this never happened. That's always the end of most well-written abuse contracts. This never happened. We can never talk about the contract we've just signed. That is off limits. In Harvey Weinstein's case, the women who were sexually abused and then intimidated for their lives. I mean, let's face it, he hired an Israeli security firm to track down the women and make sure they weren't a threat. So these women who felt for fear of their lives, their careers, etc., were forced and pressured to sign abuse contracts that included not only saying that never talking about it, that's a good shame contract right there. But they weren't even allowed a copy of the contract. And isn't that familiar? What parent has the decency and care to their child to say, we've fucked you up and twisted love around this way and that and the other, and we've got you completely turned around because that's the only way we were going to let you live in this family. But here's the contract so that you can untangle it and know what the clauses are and why we had you sign this clause and why we called torture love over here, because I didn't want to admit that I'd made a mistake, because in my family, people who made a mistake were humiliated and unlovable, and I couldn't bear feeling humiliated and unlovable. So instead of admitting that I made a mistake, I told you that my abuse was love, and so you signed here, and thank goodness I gave you a lollipop, and then we were good to go. So, the reenactment of the childhood dynamic, to such an extent that the abuse survivors cannot witness, they cannot see a copy of their own abuse contract unless accompanied by 3 of Harvey Weinstein's attorneys. They can go in and look at the abuse contract that they signed under the pressure of their cult, in this case, the Disney Corporation, a good old family value corporation. So when you deal with now your entire facilitator body is forming a wall of insanity, a wall of silence, a wall of denial, a wall of shame, a wall of betrayal that says we're committed to the whole world winning, but that does not include commitment to taking responsibility for recommending an unlicensed, untrained, incompetent human being without caveat to sexually, spiritually, psychologically abuse a high participant and leave them in a life-threatening situation as their trauma becomes PTSD. You see, it includes the entire world winning, but not the single most important area for a public nonprofit teaching sexuality and relationship to win, which is to follow the Hippocratic oath, maybe, in the mental healing terrain of don't fuck up your patient's brain, don't cause them to commit suicide, don't cause PTSD in your client. First do no harm. And so that, and do you understand how small that is? Meaning how small, we're talking about the enemy dynamic that comes when someone is incredibly small in relationship to something big. Do you understand how small it made me feel to understand that this entire circle of people who had stood round me in 30 of my workshops stating their solid commitment to a whole world winning, to transforming ignorance and fear, were asking me to never tell a single person what happened. Doesn't sound like into me, you see, does it? It sounds like a lot of secrecy, doesn't it? And never to sue high, and not to seek any support for high, and not to be apologized to by high. I asked for a multi-point apology. Their incompetence was clear by this point, so I thought they're never going to get it right if I just said apologize. So I said, please apologize for this, and this. Their answer was, they said they were sorry that I had a bad childhood. I didn't ask for your apology about my parents' abuse. I asked for an apology for your abuse. So you see this kind of interesting dynamic. We're committed to the world winning, but we're not committed to our own therapeutic patients winning. We're committed to transforming ignorance and fear for the world, but we're not willing and even interested in transforming our own ignorance, our own shame-based abuse protocol. And we will go to great lengths to ensure that our therapeutic patient is not seen by cutting them off on emails, by pressuring secrecy, by asking to sign an abuse contract, by suing to shut down this website. We go to great efforts to make sure they're not seen, because we don't want the dark side of us to be seen either. We're not committed to into me you see. We're committed to into us, our projections and our intentions of looking good is what you will see. And so this is, of course, a tremendously humiliating and small thing. And what happens in a sociopathic environment where you have a large sociopathic mass in a shame, fear, survival pattern with a small regressed person is it induces hate. Now, we are all emotionally illiterate, so I don't fault you for not knowing the ingredients of hate. I had a lot of time to study it. And so hate is a combination of hurt, of terror, and a sense of betrayal and helplessness to make things right. A sense that something is wrong and has been done wrong, that someone knows and could easily help if they wanted to. But they're selling that out to look good or feel a little bit better or bury it. And suddenly you have hate. And you understand then that hate plays an incredibly important role in transforming sociopathic systems. Because hate gives mass. It's a very strong, concentrated energy. It gives mass to an individual to propel through a tremendous amount of fear and sociopathic collusion by a group. And so it's actually a stepping stone towards power, which once you have power, the hate falls away because you're no longer helpless. The only people who feel hate have the mixture of powerlessness, helplessness, deep hurt, fear, terror, and a sense that there is a sociopathic betrayal by a superior mass. That's where the helplessness comes from. And so as soon as that dissolves, there's no hate. And so if you want to end the hate in the world, look at every terrified, regressed, small, dishonored faction of people and ensure that their survival, security, love and belonging and self-esteem is honored. And the hate will disappear like that. You want to know why Iraqis hate the United States? Because they drove armored cars, shooting up 6-year-old girls. They bashed grandmothers out of gas stations. They shot at anything that moved. They were a vastly superior force, terrorizing an entire cult or culture and playing noble about it. This was to end the war on terror. Can you imagine anything more schizophrenic than giving 1 million Iraqis PTSD to fight the war on an emotion? See, you understand how dangerous it is that we're emotionally illiterate. We don't understand what hate is. We don't understand what the difference between a feeling and an emotion is. And we don't understand that you can't go to war with a feeling. And we certainly don't seem to grasp that spending $1 trillion to give 1 million Iraqis PTSD is not a war on terror. It's becoming the biggest bully in town. And we don't get this as a cult. We don't get this as a cult. And so we are emotionally illiterate. And this is, of course, we feel small. We feel stupid because we are small and we are stupid. Our cult has made us stupid in these areas. It's not personal. It's not like you or I was singled out. We have committed to an education system that, voids, we don't get a single hour of emotional literacy in college or high school. Can you imagine how dumb that is? We are 1/3, in the human experience, we are 1/3 emotion and feelings. We're 1/3 thoughts and awareness and consciousness, and we're 1/3 sensation. That's the human experience. And we get a little bit of physical training, nothing useful like healthy diet and stuff like that. Oh no, let's just make our people obese. But we get a little bit of physical training. We get lots of schooling on where to look and turn our mind, and more importantly, where not to look. But not a single hour of emotional literacy, other than, in fact, to shame the people who are most emotional by calling them too emotional, as opposed to calling a very numb culture not emotional enough. And so in this dynamic of smallness and smallness and smallness, we have an enemy dynamic, because when the traumatic biology identifies that you are surrounded by sociopaths who will use superior mass to leverage you into a position that is harmful for you and good for their image, you have a fear of death, because that is a real possibility. Not always directly. Sometimes you just kill yourself with addictions because you feel so shamed and small and so humiliated. You just drink your own death away, and it's very nice for your abuser, because their secret is safe with your corpse once you drink yourself to the grave, or overdose on drugs, or binge watch and get fat in front of a TV. The truth has been numbed out of you. But this leads to an enemy dynamic, and for a great deal of this time, I have felt uncertain if I would live on multiple levels. Would I survive financially? Very uncertain. Would I survive physically? How many years would this take off my life? I knew I was going through 500 to 600% more stress per day than I'd gone through in the rest of the life, and I could feel it aging and killing my body. But how many years would it take off if I did live? How much pain would I endure? What about my social survival? Would I end up isolated and alone to protect my abusers, since my primary source of love and belonging, the high community, was being gate-kept on the condition of secrecy by my abusers, who did not want to give the community the choice to decide whether or not to hire Peter Sandhill based on accurate information. They wanted to give them the choice to hire Peter Sandhill or not, based on glowing recommendations without caveat and without disclosing his license status. And that's not a choice. You know, when the OxyContin family, the family behind the drug OxyContin, part of the opioid crisis, wanted to make sure that they could make, a few hundred more million on on OxyContin, they suppressed the data about the high levels of addiction and all of that, and they shamed the people who came forward with addiction. They shamed them so they could make more money. That's not a choice. That's misinformation. That's criminal negligence. That's a violation of the Hippocratic Oath. And so we have a lot of forces that are pushing this towards enemy. Trauma does that almost always. The small dynamic and the big escalates fear and adrenaline, etc., and brings in the fight, flight, freeze dynamic. And you can watch me throughout this whole period. The more animated in adrenaline and the more terrified I am, and the more blaming I am. Because when you feel very small and you are bullied by something that's big, blame is a natural phenomenon. You don't feel it. Codependency becomes very relevant. I mean, how do you tell a 6-year-old boy who's being repeatedly punched up by his twice as big older brother that he's in a codependent relationship and that's his responsibility to sort out? It's a joke. It's abuse to say something like that. You have to get the relationship into some semblance of equality. And the interesting thing, because it's been very clear that the facilitators have prioritized their fear of legal and image issues ahead of all other concerns. If you look at their pattern of behavior, you can look at one thing they've done after another and said these people were afraid of legal issues. They have far secondary is that they are concerned about doing the right thing for the client and the community. And so it's very interesting that in the abusive power dynamic, they've they've pushed very hard for that. But in doing so, they've positioned themselves where very few courts could try them and find them innocent because of this pattern of abuse and all. So it's very interesting the way that their primary loyalty to legal issues has led them to behave in a way that is, can you imagine a jury listening to a 10-hour recording of Peter Sandhill sexually abusing a therapeutic client, which I have, a 10-hour recording. All the facilitators have that. I gave it to them. Of a facilitator sexually abusing a therapeutic client under the influence of 2 Schedule I drugs that he pushed against the client's will to take 3 times more than the client wished, and then, went in this wild goose chase of abuse throughout the session, didn't show up on time, one thing after another. And then, high as a public nonprofit, on record sending an abuse contract to a client, saying, you promise never to tell anyone that this happened and never to sue High? As opposed to, what can we do to help clean up our mess? You can't get a more easy, send them all to jail, find the millions, shut them down type of scenario. And it's dramatically fascinating. I'm convinced the High facilitators couldn't apologize, partly because they couldn't face their own shadow, and partly because they were told by faulty legal representation, meaning any lawyer would look at this and say, you're complete fools if you don't try and clean this up, because I can't defend sex, drug abusing, unlicensed, incompetent idiots. The more this goes into court, the more you are knocked down. So don't make this go to court. Apologize, for goodness sake. Not a single facilitator would apologize except Peter Sandhill. And that only after severe pressure from his peers, meaning I had to, anyway. So you have all these different dynamics that force the enemy dynamic. So where's the friendship come in? Where do how can friendship exist in this terrain? And another way of saying that is, how can you win while losing? So obviously years off of my life, biggest pain, tremendous amount of suffering and unnecessary pain. To protect positions that are completely indefensible in a court of law, in a therapy, training group, basic common sense. No grandmother would put their child through this unless they wanted to kill them. There's no level at which the facilitator's behavior stands up as being even moderately ethical. And they're putting themselves as these teachers of love and intimacy and all that. So how does winning occur? And that's partly, has to be looked at. How do you win while you lose? In stock markets, you buy put options. So you think the stock will go up. So you buy it, but you also buy put options, so it goes down. You make money on the options, and it kind of hedges your bet. But how do you, in a dynamic and abuse like this, how do you win? I asked Peter Sandhill, and this is a very important thing because this was a very deep and sincere request. I asked Peter Sandhill during the psychedelic session to make my voice and my talents visible. I said, please help me to bring my gifts, which I'm failing to bring out into the world. Please help me bring those gifts out into the world where they can be seen. And this was apparently of no consequence to Peter Sandhill because he ignored it. He didn't answer the question. He never circled around. It was just one more fumble in a very intense game at very high leverage when you're having your first psychedelic experience, your first homosexual experience, your first channeling experience. You know, when you've been pushed into an overdose beyond your comfort zone, it's a very high leveraged environment to fumble the ball, so many times. So Peter fumbled. He never came back to that. And yet, let's look at what's happened here. I decided that whether I died or lived, I would talk about the issues as candidly as I could and break the conspiracy and the contract of secrecy and silence as the first step of giving our cult back its abuse contract. And that might even be worth a lifetime. If that got me killed, either through health or anxiety or whatever, or other things, that could be worth a lifetime, considering the vast amount of suffering that is caused to the species worldwide as a result of secrecy, silence, and shame around these abuse dynamics. So I decided to talk about them all. Well, in the course, I've developed my voice. I have become an advocate for people who are way more vulnerable than I am, with way less resources, but who are going through the same hell. And it has never escaped me, in agonizing pain, stuffing my face to try and numb, the pain to a point that I could go to sleep. It has never escaped me that I couldn't have asked for a nicer set of people to abuse me. My parents, hippies, sent me to Waldorf school. I mean, great abusers. And my teachers at Waldorf school, terrorizing me, sending me down in the cellar in kindergarten and saying I'd be eaten by witches, hitting me, neglecting all the traumatic symptoms from home. It's like still, charming people, dedicated idealists to a last one. So most people don't get the benefit of being abused by their therapist, with pleasant voices and decent communication skills when they want to use them. So, compared to a 6-year-old being fucked up by dad every few evenings in a drunk, this is nothing. And it nearly killed me. So I've got resources that most people don't have. And so in a certain way, this has sharpened my voice and my talent. So now what am I doing? I'm working to end homelessness in my town by doing the same. And what do I find in my town? The exact same protocol of the facilitator. Silence, misinformation, delay, defense. We don't talk about that. We don't look at complete insanity, spending vast amounts of public money to make things worse rather than better for our homeless by making it illegal to have cheap, low-cost, safe places to sleep. Just does it right there. And so anyway, I'm working with homelessness. And once I grasped how insane the facilitator protocol around me was, it also helped me second guess my protocol that I'd learned at High, which was asking for my 100%. And so the very next woman that I met after grasping this, I didn't ask, what's my 100%? I asked how I could help her survive, feel secure, feel a sense of love and belonging, develop her self-esteem, grow and bring her gifts to the world, and become, profoundly, a source of profound abundance as she brought her gifts to the world. And that woman is now my wife. So in other words, understanding that a lot of things at high were backwards. So this is one way you can win while losing. And it's one of the ways that you can have a dark friend in your enemy. My mother taught me that lying was a lose, 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 lose. So I've never lied to a friend, to a partner, to a lover. Never. Never cheated, never lied. And that, my mother didn't teach me by telling the truth. She taught me with the pain of lying and betrayal. My father was endlessly blaming everything and everyone, never taking responsibility. So I've taken a lot of responsibility in my life, thrown off course a lot with this dynamic, but generally speaking, taken a lot of responsibility. And I remember when I was 38, I was feeling quite bitter and cynical. And so I said, okay, we know where this ends up. This ends up where Dad ends up. So what didn't Dad do that he could have done at age 38 that would set the future to a different course? And I thought, he never told the truth. He never was emotionally vulnerable, which would have meant telling the truth. And he never really went for what he wanted. So he punished people for the rest of his life for not getting what he wanted. So I thought, I've already broken, the first thing, I always, tell the truth. I've been more vulnerable emotionally than anyone in the family by a factor of 5. And, and then I've made that a kind of a centerpiece in my relationships is deep transparency and vulnerability. But I'm not going for everything I want. So I made a bucket list and I did it all. And, bitterness evaporated because I learned from a dark teacher. And so you can win, and I have learned how to do the opposite. And generally, for example, my wife is a trauma survivor, and generally the way I've grown a lot of our relationship is I say, what would Peter have done here? What would Anne have done here? What would Hai have done here? Now let me do the exact opposite of that. And, it has grown more rapidly into positive terrain than any other relationship in my life. After, trying roughly 100 lover relationships with focusing on my 100%, and my 100%, ask for permission, make requests, set boundaries, and see what happens. And, I've never had my full 100%. Obviously all 100 relationships, are no more. But here I am married, growing and growing and growing and growing by looking at how I can bring out the best and be the person that helps my wife's soul and spirit come into the world and be alive and beautiful. And that's what, of course, I was looking for, a single adult. Grown-ups can't do this, but adults can actually put another human being ahead of themselves, deep enough to see them, can love enough to care, can care enough to see, can see enough to understand, can understand enough to be empathetic, can become empathetic enough to attune, can attune enough to succeed, can succeed enough to create safety, pleasure, a sense of balance, and respect and honor, and do that enough to create an abundance, which naturally leads to gratitude, joy, safety, pleasure, and the feeling of love. Love becomes love through the path of competency. And so, that works very well. So how how are the facilitators my friends in this dynamic? Well, I've had to face death. I've had to face death multiple times in this issue. And believe it or not, this is one of the initiation processes to going from a grown-up to an adult. And tribes, in very early human times, tribes might send a teenager out into the wild for a month to say, go on. If they came back alive, they were considered a valued adult in the tribe. If they died, well, nothing lost, nothing gained. If they couldn't survive, then we don't want them in the tribe. Pretty cruel, pretty harsh. In the Emerald Forest, we see a little bit more humane thing with, a vision of snuff, burning ants, endurance tests. We have, rituals of going through caves and feeling and going through the womb. But the bottom line is that most cultures in human history understood that you could not trust a grown-up, particularly a man, until they had faced death and had a transcendent state or a transcendent vision that was bigger than the cult to which they belonged. Then they could be a valuable leader. And we give our kids too much sugar, too much pornography, too many screens, dopamine and adrenaline, and too much shame. And they do not become adults. My parents weren't adults. They were deeply regressed children, terrified of their own feelings, and terrified of their children having any feelings as well. And so the facing of death, has, and it was mostly for caring for another, because I'm the older person in the marriage with my wife. And in Asian culture, the older person actually, it's not about exploiting and raping the feminine and the young. The honored tradition in many Asian cultures is that the older person, and the business person also, protects and takes care of and is part family. It's very beautiful to see in this phenomenon in Thailand. But there's a sense of, the older person or the more powerful person caring. In the Philippines, you can call any older woman ati, which is aunt. And if you call an older woman aunt, she must protect you. If she has anything worth her salts of cultural values, you are under her protection. We would never hear of something like that. We just lost it in that regard. And so, some of the reasons I've grown up is to love my wife and protect and ensure, a variety of things like that. I think some people grow up when they have children, they become an adult when they grasp that there is something bigger involved than their own minutiae of addictions and pleasures of the moment. But anyway, I have grown up to some extent. The pain is a great teacher, and I found myself at, in significantly high levels of pain. And so, it's very motivating to figure something out. And so I've studied more than 1,000 hours of psychology and trauma and shame and stuff and all this kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of learning, that comes with that. I have a more accurate map in the terrain of relationships and psychology than I did before by a 500% margin. Now that's a significant gift. So that's winning in the face of losing. Massive amounts of pain, why not learn from it? Unsure of survival, why not document it? So winning while losing. And then, of course, there's the phenomena that none of us win without a cult, without being part of a cult. And let's face it, every culture in human history has some areas that are rational and understandable, and then other areas that are just cult-like idiocy. If we in the United States were to chop off the tip of our next generation of females, we would be up in arms because we would be genital mutilation, traumatization, and outrage. So why is that going on with infant boys today? It's just cult bullshit. We did it before, we'll do it again. This is the cult thing. I mean, there's nothing. I mean, it's the kind of thing that if it hadn't happened before, we would not be doing it. But we'll turn around and talk about how cult-like they are over in Africa, where they still do female genital mutilation while still allowing male genital mutilation as a matter of course, or the separation from the child and the mother, which led Theodore Kaczynski to develop his hatred towards technology. The Unabomber went into a sociopathic state after being separated after a traumatic operation with his family, and they said he was never the same after the doctors insisted on separating him from his safety and security and his parents, and then traumatizing him and pretending that did not matter. Why? Because it was cult protocol. Pure and simple psychological traumatic abuse with no scientific basis. Oh, children, get over that. Well, tell that to the people blown up by the Unabomber. And the passion of hating technology is understandable to someone who's never been able to get in touch with their humanity from the point that scientists and technologists stole his soul by traumatizing him and pretending it was for his own good, and then leaving him there for a lifetime. Yet another casualty on the war of stupidity, the war of terror on human beings that we don't want to deal with in our cult. We don't want to deal with, so we just arm up. And then there's the fact that in each person there is a split of personas, meaning every single facilitator had voices within them that softened their fear, their shame, and their abuse, that knew something was off. Now, it wasn't enough to actually tell the truth and do all this and say, how can we help? And the most basic human thing. We have hurt you. How can we help? No, that wasn't enough for a single person on the facilitator body or board to say that. But it was enough they debated it, whether or not to say that. And they had what I would call a minority faction within the facilitator body that thought apologizing was a good idea. Ann Watts thought it was a good idea. She wasn't willing to go rogue, but she thought it was a good idea. And so she was lobbying to have the facilitators actually apologize for something. She didn't apologize for training my abuser and recommending him as the last person to do so, but she thought the other facilitator should. So there is a faction in this dynamic that's trying to have some it's trying to be nice. It's just too scared. It's too ignorant. It's too shame-based. Getting too much misguided legal consult. To do so, and those parts are the friends of the community. In other words, there's not all good. There's not all bad in anyone. There's an abuser in me that doesn't know what the hell he's doing. And then there's a part of me that's sad at the consequences of my abuse. And then there's a part of me that lets myself be abused by other people and doesn't feel powerful to stop it. And there's a part of me that feels sad and wants to do something about that. And then there's parts that feel overwhelmed. There's a whole group of people inside, every human being, that is a microcosm of the cult outside. And those people that care inside and out are my friends. The parts of me that say, no, we're not going to be shut up and shamed into silence are my friends. And there's big parts of me that say, no, it's too dangerous. It's too dangerous. You're going to get killed. You're going to die. It's not safe. Even worse, you'll be hated and outcast. For a terrified, lonely, traumatized child, that is much worse than death. You will be hated and outcast if you tell the truth. Don't do it. Don't do it. And there are parts of me that say, no, there are other people involved in this. There are going to be a long line of people affected by whether or not we tell the truth. So how do we become strong enough? How do we become big enough to face hostility, to face fear, to face attack from those frightened, ignorant, in an abuse cult in which they are unwitting, sleeping participants that are terrified of pulling back the veil to the level and seeing the level of cruelty towards themselves, towards others, towards the most vulnerable people in our culture. And how can we love those terrified, wounded parts enough so that we can take some heat to be a part of transforming and making this world a better place? A place which would elicit less hatred, less hostility in the smallest and most vulnerable members of our cult, who are often our childhood sexual, psychological abuse survivors, that High does nothing for, because High won't even name the definition of abuse. It won't deal with the dynamics of addiction. It will not define what love is and is not to disentangle those abuse contracts. So High is leaving them in the lurch. That's not ideal, not ideal. And so if Peter Sandhill won't let me find my voice with his conscious, active support, his shadow side, the more crazily High behaves, the more my voice rises and develops, experience and all of that. And so there's interesting fusions and alliances between the dark and the light in this domain. So I've become an adult. I've found my voice. I've become, I should say I've become 30% of an adult, because there are still terrors, hurt small places that I would rather die than face. And in those areas, I'm not an adult, and I'm not safe to myself or anyone else. And this is a very important thing to acknowledge. And it's a great kindness when someone will tell you where they are or not where they are and are not safe and why. No one's ever done that for me. It's a great kindness to do that to anyone. I'm safe for you here. I'm not safe here. I'm competent here. I know nothing here. I am your worst nightmare in this terrain, and I'm pretty good over here. Those distinctions are absolutely vital in our cult, and High glosses over them all by just saying, we're really great, we're here to help, and we're going to fuck you over here, and we're going to help you here, and then we're going to cover it up here, and we'll fuck you up some more over here, and then we're not going to touch this at all, and then we'll help you over here. And this is the room of love. Let's just jumble it all in there. So how, so we've got, obviously, we can see the friendship. So as the power dynamic shifts Now, takes an extraordinary amount of work, 1,000 hours of study, finding voice, 100 hours of energy healing with one practitioner, 200 hours of massage with another, more than 2,000 hours of videos, finding the kind of resonance in different channels and stuff, triggered all by these topics, influenced by these topics. Over a dozen YouTube channels on different flavors of this. Then learning a whole variety of things, including film. I mean, my first videos, I understood that in an image-based cult, you see, in our cult, we pay more attention to the tone, the face, the lighting, and things like that than we actually do to the truth, because we're so sociopathically numb in many cases, and we're so materialistic, so chauvinistic on the focus on the surface, that we don't actually pay attention to profoundly substantive truths that come to us through politically low-ranking individuals. Our homeless can teach us a ton. I've interviewed a number of homeless people. Every single time I've learned something. Why aren't people interviewing the homeless? Because they're low-ranking, you see? So we're a ranking cult, where if you're articulate and sophisticated and this and that and the other, and particularly if you can make witty remarks about high, traumatic levels of pain, because we don't want to deal with the reality of terror and pain in ourselves, so we like to be distracted from it. If you can do all that, then you are listened to. But a terrified child can say more with her silence and looking down at the floor than the most articulate pontificator in the room with any number of degrees. The child can reveal the corruption of cult, of power, of family abuse, and the doom of our civilization are in her eyes. Because if we cannot lift a child out of trauma, it is only a matter of time before Trump or someone like him gets hold of nuclear weapons. And the individual that has learned that they are garbage and worthless is the individual who will blow up the world. And those child's eyes tell that story of our betrayal. As we turn away, maybe she's a beggar, maybe she's homeless, maybe she's uneducated, maybe she's young. In our chauvinism, as we turn away from her eyes to the CNN presenter or whatever, we are turning away from a deeper truth to look on the surface and sealing the increased probability field of violence and betrayal. Both Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler, both severely traumatized children. We hate ourselves when we deny the prioritization of the feminine, which is the felt emotional experience of those most vulnerable within men and women. We hate ourselves when we turn away from more deep and substantive truths to the addictive chatterboxes on TV that are committed. If you study the movement from actual news to entertainment that has gone on in news, corporations that are committed to providing a nice balance of dopamine and well, I forget the other chemicals, but they're structured to provide a nice mix, and their peak and their highest ad sales are right after a big little adrenaline burst. Then they give you a sexy woman, selling a Porsche or something, or pretending that sexy women are somehow intricately connected with a certain type of soap, when of course they're not. Have you ever seen a sexy woman when you bought a bar of soap? Of course not. But by confusing the brain and doing this bullshit right after a high adrenaline peak, they sell more product, and so they have to produce an adrenaline peak for their advertisers, because otherwise the advertisers won't pay as much for that slot. It's a special slot right on the other side of adrenaline. And so, that's your key thing if you want to sell lots of useful or useless products. Create an adrenaline rush and then answer it with an ad that has, of course, nothing to do with it. But it will fool the body into buying product. And it's one of the many ways we betray our children and one another by selling attention to the highest bidder rather than valuing truth and integrity and information. So how is this the friend of, because it's also easy to understand the enemy dynamic. Anyone who has an abuse contract that is afraid and believes they will die if they tell the truth about the abuse, I am, of course, the enemy, because I'm telling the truth. And your contract says that if you tell the truth, you will be killed. So sometimes that's by association. Remember the old communist things? Have you ever been or been part of the Communist Party? We're going to ruin your career. We're going to blackball. We are going to destroy you for associating with someone different than us. And so, this, I don't want anything to do with this, because I signed an abuse contract that's kept me alive, that said that I don't talk about this and that. I know you've changed. Let's just never talk about it again. My abuser is happy. I survived. Let's not go into it. So there's an enemy dynamic there. There's also a friendship, though, because somewhat to my surprise, I'm still alive. Wasn't guaranteed, but here I am, and I've broken my contract to never tell the truth about how I feel. I've broken the contract to hide the politically incorrect, nightmarish behavior of powerful people who could deny me some of my human needs to survive, to feel secure, to have a sense of love and belonging and self-esteem. My email accounts got cut off as soon as it was clear I would tell this story. I got sued for the first time in my life as soon as it was clear that I would tell this story on this domain. It wasn't that High wanted the domain. They hadn't bought it for 20 years. Give me a break. They could have bought it any time in the last 20 years for $8. Now, they didn't want the domain, but they didn't want this story associated with the domain. So once I got the domain and notified them, then they wanted to sue to reclaim the domain. Of course, they lost the lawsuit because the courts were not invented to protect sexual abusers from hiding their story when they were too lazy to buy their own domains. But they lost that particular case. But imagine what it's like to be sued by 4 of your therapists in a regressed state, and understand that it's not a high issue that you've been sexually abused by a high facilitator, but it is a high issue to sue you if you tell the story. Now that's a little bit of a tongue twister, isn't it? Piece that out and figure out how the whole world wins when more sexual abuse stays secret, silenced by awareness institutes. If you can figure that out and come out sane, you're better than I am. And so there's the enemy dynamic of telling the truth. I would venture to say that unless you've done exceptionally deep and unusual work that less than 1% of Americans have done, you have abuse contracts with your abusers. Bringing this up will bring up the fear of death. And you'll turn away from that fear and stay slave to that contract until you die. This cult will be quite happy to support you with endless food, addictions, etc. Or you will turn into this, in which case I become a friend. The facilitators as well. As I mentioned, there's a faction. My sense was that 30% within each facilitator wanted to do the right thing, and that this expressed itself within the facilitator body, that 30% of the facilitators lobbied the other 70% of the facilitators to do the right thing. But obviously that wasn't the majority vote. The majority vote was shut the guy up, deny all, deny, don't offer support, try and spin this as love, and move on. We've got important workshops on love, intimacy, and sexuality to teach, so let's do it. We can't be distracted from our workshops by the mere fact that some of our clients get sexually abused by facilitators. And that's obviously a very tragic thing to realize, but that's my sense, is whether it was a 60-30 split. And I've always known that threat of court combined with the innate goodness in the facilitators would pivot that roughly 30%, or it was obviously a minority stake, because the board and the facilitators never once asked, how can we help? We're terribly sorry, and this is our responsibility. I mean, that's all it takes for a single adult in the mix to actually behave competently, to love enough to be competent, as opposed to just frantically spout the word love and run off like, frightened children. And so my sense was that the combination of the innate goodness in the facilitators plus legal action or clear, consistent threat would bring the fear voice in favor of doing the right thing. So when you've got the chance of covering it all up, the fear voice is saying, do whatever it takes to cover it up. But if it's clear that you'll be sued into oblivion, have millions of dollars of fines, this and that and the other, now the fear voice tips towards, well, we know it's the right thing and we want to do that anyway. So if we're going to be sued, we've got no choice but to do the right thing. And so that would kind of solidify the inner political faction of every ego and every group towards doing the right thing. It was just something very, very precious that was lost, which I realized would be lost in that dynamic. And that was real love. Because when someone does the right thing under threat of being sued, that has chosen not to do the right thing for 4 years, it's insincere, meaning as soon as the threat evaporates, the fear voice now goes back to secrecy and hiding again, because that's how fear operates. I mean, the shame-fear dynamic is that parts of me are unlovable. That's the only reason to have secrets, by the way. If you've got a shame secret, it's because you believe you will not be loved in the truth of who you are right there. Because you're unable to love yourself, your parents were unable to love that part of you, and you've watched the abuse cult pulverize those parts, right and left. And so that's your assessment. So then how do I survive if the truth is not lovable? Well, you survive by secrets. Every person needs to survive, feel secure, have a sense of love and belonging, have a sense of self-esteem. If you are in an abuse cult, parts of who you are will be decimated sociopathically if they are revealed. And so you believe that. Now, the sad thing is, of course, teachers of love and intimacy and sexuality believe that their own community would abandon them if the truth came out, or they would have led with the truth, as I asked Jason Weston to do, because it is the ethical thing to do. It's the obvious thing to do for a cult teaching into me you see. For a cult teaching choice. You are at choice. No, you're not. Not if your facilitators are lying to you. You have no choice. Because they're presenting reality like A, because they're hiding the parts that reveal reality like B. Now you're making a choice based on a false perception. If you buy my company because I tell you it's worth $300 million, but I'm suppressing a $400 million debt on the balance sheet, I've not only committed fraud, broken the law, etc., I've robbed your choice. you've not made a choice worth anything. You've actually damaged yourself because you're trusting the information that's creating this. And when the facilitators deny and blockade the public from understanding that they are occupying a position that says sexual abuse by a high facilitator is fine and not a high issue, and we're going to express that by not even offering the client a refund. Do you know how sociopathic you have to be? You see, even after Peter Sandhill apologized under great duress, because the first time I paid him $175 an hour and asked him to apologize, and he had nothing to apologize for. That was when I was paying him to reflect on his incompetence in multiple domains and apologize for anything. He had nothing to apologize for. So now he's made this apology under duress. Meaning, when you have a completely corrupt position, it's a mathematical phenomena. It's not, subjective. It's mathematical. When you have a weak position, the more light, weight, and energy you put on that position, the more you fall over. For example, an inverted triangle is a very weak position. You can knock it over this way, this way, this way. It's a weak position. Now, a triangle like this on the ground, the more weight you put on it, the more solid it is. This is a mathematical issue. When you break the law, the more you go into court around the position that you're holding to, the more you end up in jail or heavily fined. That's just a reality. When you break psychotherapeutic guidelines, don't have sex with a patient, for one. When you break a psychotherapeutic paradigm, the more therapists are exposed to the situation, the more concerned they are that their clients go to you for teaching. When you break multiple cult taboos, again, don't have sex with a client, don't have sex under the influence of psychedelics, all this stuff, nobody trusts you because you're not trustworthy. So when you hold weak positions that are, they're held by the absence of repair and apology and public acknowledgement. When effort is spent to silence and suppress rather than transform, that's how someone defends a position. These positions fall apart. I mean, can you imagine a single cogent sentence coming out of a facilitator in a public national press conference if the New York Times gets a hold of this? Well, does the New York Times have to get a hold of this before the facilitators are willing to say, okay, fine, you've called our bluff, we'll apologize because this is full of shit and was full of shit to begin with. And we don't want to look like complete idiots to the complete world. We're willing to look like idiots to you. Why? Because you don't matter. Because you don't matter. So that goes back to that feeling of smallness, which creates that trauma and stuff. So, but how is this a friend to high and the facilitators? Because this is a very important thing. Well, if you understand that there's always some part of us that wants to do the right thing. What is the right thing? The thing that works. It works to apologize when your own incompetence led to a therapeutic patient being sexually abused by one of your own. It works. Try it. See, it works. And it doesn't work to go into a level of insanity that every single objective person would say is a complete joke and make your entire mission and organization a joke simply to avoid facing your fear of appearing incompetent, which you are, but which you can begin to do something about if you acknowledge the incompetence. And so you have this area where, as I said, there are small parts of me and deep wounds that are so painful and terrifying that I would literally rather die than go into those places alone and feel the shame and hate directed at those parts of me by the people I depend on or depended on at the time for survival, security, love and belonging and self-esteem. People kill themselves all the time rather than avoid those feelings. People drive their businesses over cliffs. People destroy their marriages rather than feel those feelings. And a friend in our cult wants to be nice. A friend in our cult wants to be nice. And it's hard to nicely guide your partner into an initiation of spiritual adulthood by facing the parts you would do anything not to face. In a cult that guarantees submersion into those wounds at a time when we can't deal with it, and pretty thoroughly guarantees silence and loneliness in those psychic domains in each one of us. And in that dynamic, a friend can't bring themselves to initiate you in the fire of facing death in adulthood, but an enemy can. And here we have that paradoxical narrows, where your enemy, your nemesis, may be the one who loves you the most. The nemesis, and part of the one that will right the wrong and will pursue endlessly. Nemesis, inside and out, forces us under pain of death, of revenge, to face what we would do almost anything to avoid facing. And in doing so, allows the possibility of transcendence. When you have walked through your deepest pain in the smallest part of your psyche, you transcend death. Death is no longer frightening. One of the reasons death is so frightening is we do face every part of ourselves. We do walk through the narrowest corridor we create. We do face the impact we have on other people. And it's horrifying for an emotionally illiterate, traumatized, abuse survivor and abusing addict to face that level of pain. And we stack that cruelty onto a good chunk of our modernly sophisticated lives. We don't know how to die well in this cult. And we don't love ourselves enough to do something about it. But our enemy, who has experienced the spear, the horror of our lies, of our insanity, often does push the abuser. You see, and the abuser begs for their life. Peter Sandhill begged me to save his career, and I was too nice at the time to be truly helpful to Peter. I should have slapped him up in the face and said, "Look at you, fucker. You still don't get it. You were self-centered by not bothering to get trained. You were self-centered in glossing over your abuse 10 years earlier. You were self-centered during the session of massive abuse of power. You took off and then made it worse by recommending this bizarre marriage. You refused to apologize while being paid. And now, you little shitface, You're about to ruin your career. Wham! Wake up, you fucker! Wake up! You call yourself a healer? Wake up! Wake up! Stop fucking up your life. Stop fucking up mine. Stop fucking up high. Get your head screwed around straight. Honor your containments or get the fuck out of this career before you do severe damage. You've already damaged your own and my soul at a deep level. Wake the fuck up. And don't you dare make requests about your career until you've cleaned up your mess. You see, someone who's sweet and pleasing in an abuse contract they haven't broken will do what I did and say, okay, Peter, and tell the facilitators and board not to fire him. Now, as soon as I did that, Peter betrayed me again. That's what addicts do. So I wasn't kind enough to be cruel, and so here we have, I wasn't kind enough to save Peter Sandhill from his own myopia, from his own addiction, from his own cruelty to himself, his family, and to me. I paid an enormous price for that, but so did Peter, so did Hai, so did all of you. And so there's this intersection again. You see, had I wanted to hurt Peter, I might have been kind to him at the time. This is the irony. But I wanted to be nice to Peter, so I hurt everyone by going along with his bullshit. Which is that a sexual abuser's interests to keep their career are more important than an entire community to have the truth come out and to have sexual abuse eliminated within the power structure by retraining and true atonement. You see, and of course, because of this training and betrayal of myself, you see, the facilitators are, of course, not terribly trustworthy. You see, but neither am I, because I wanted to be nice. And being nice exposed all of you in the community to more bullshit for more years. You see, so there's this interesting paradox. I had no idea how much pain was going to come from being nice. Of course, Peter didn't know either. We're both idiots, raised in this cult of emotional illiteracy, you name it. How dumb do you have to be an organization that escalates sexuality by an average of 500% and not teach traumatic protocols or abuse repair? I never learned a goddamn thing about how to respond to sexual abuse within the community, violence, anything. Just stay out of it was the message at the high office when I asked, what do I do here? Or I brought things to Anne. She never said, oh, that's trauma, here's what you need to do about it. She just, I don't know, pay me to listen to you. And that's cruel. That's cruel to Anne's clients. That's cruel to Anne. She doesn't want to be inept and useless. But if someone doesn't point out what she doesn't know, everyone is enabling her ineptness, which is setting up the community to fail, not to win, to fail. So again, you have something, where our cult's definition of niceness, usually friends are defined in our cult by who will pamper the ego when the ego is miffed about something. And by that definition, Peter Sandhill has a great number of friends. But that's not really a friend. A friend is someone who will give you an accurate map of reality that will help you create more well-being than any other map of reality. If you're heading into a chasm in a snowstorm, in a blizzard, and you say, I have a good feeling about this, and you've got some fucked up friend filled with positivity and new age bullshit who says, oh yeah, I support you, carry on. Well, is that a friend when they show up dead after the blizzard? Or is that a nutcase who doesn't know the difference between truth-telling and supporting bullshit because they've read too many books on affirmations? And of course, High doesn't talk about that either. And so, if you think of a friend as someone who challenges you to deal with a map of reality that works, that leads to success because it works, that is sustainable because it works, that is integrated, and that's why it works, then that friend is the one that it doesn't matter how many people are lemmingly falling over the cliff. It says, fuck that. That's not the way to go. Turn around and do a 180. And that's what I'm asking High to do. Turn around and do a 180. Loudly, clearly, definitively. And accept my friendship. And they can do that in court and lose hundreds of thousands of dollars, or I don't think they'll be able to pay the full fine that would be appropriate, for this level of stupidity in a professional relationship. They can do it in court. They can help the public win. See, so let's take one more slice of the winning, and friendship dynamic. We like to pretend, because we are culturally illiterate. We are the most culturally illiterate in the United States, because if you travel to most countries around the world, they know more about themselves, other countries, and America than America knows about them. So they're more culturally literate than Americans. So Americans are among the most culturally illiterate people on the planet. And it's a pity, because they're also some of the most dumb in certain areas where other people do a much better job. And they're too dumb to know that they're dumb because they're culturally illiterate and myopic. So why would you possibly learn about other countries when you've decided that you're number one? And you haven't even bothered with defining what that. Number one at obesity, number one at not providing parental leave, number one. What are you number one at? You think everyone should have a military 25 times bigger than everyone else's so they can drop bombs on weddings and train teenagers to do drone strikes? Well, what is it? What's this great thing? How about measuring national happiness? How about doing one census a month on how many Americans feel secure in survival, how many Americans are surviving, how many feel secure in survival, how many Americans have a deep sense of love and belonging, 1 to 10? How many Americans like themselves and have a high sense of self-esteem? Privately, How many Americans feel they have developed their gifts and are bringing them out to the world? How many Americans feel a sense of abundance and accomplishment that they've brought their talents out in the world? And how many Americans are in touch with something bigger than themselves that they are in service to, that serves the country, the world, the species, the planet, etc.? Well, that's a pretty good metric. Those are the human needs, by the way, as Abraham Maslow, and I've amended them a little bit in certain ways. But this is every human need. Every human has these needs. So how many Americans are doing that? How many high participants are at what point on that hierarchy of needs? What about the facilitators? What about the facilitators? it's the team. How many team members are secure in their survival? How many team members have a deep sense of love and belonging? That's relevant data. And if you respond to it in protocols that lift that metric so that next month those metrics read more intelligently or there's more well-being in there, more people have their needs met, then that's progress. And the protocol that got you there is your friend. It's never perfect. It's about a direction. You want to go up and up and up and up, and then you get hit with some crisis and trauma, and you just up and up and up. That's intelligence. I've never received such a poll from my country. Is it really too expensive to send out an email to actually know how I'm doing as a citizen paying 50% of my money to this government? Too much to ask how I'm actually doing in terms of my human needs and publish that so that we can address that nationally? We're committed to ignorance. And so, surprise, surprise, the high facilitators are committed to ignorance, willful ignorance and criminal negligence. One and the same. Willful ignorance and criminal negligence. So, of course, they don't ask how I'm doing. And this is what my point. Once we have vaguely figured out what causes harm, and I think most people would agree that sexually abusing a client under the influence of psychedelics with personal agendas that transcend the well-being of that client is not a good idea. Why? Because nothing good comes of it. You ever heard of the person who lived happily ever after because their therapist sexually abused them? I haven't. So, why would you do that? For money. The whole premise is you're supposed to help the person, not fuck them up. So Peter's the bad guy, right? But this is kind of level one thinking. So here we polarize to good guys and bad guys. And what we deny in that, and it's good to do that, by the way, that's level one, accountability. Get the bad guys, stop them doing what they're doing, and get them out of power, right? So that what? We can have a new batch of bad guys. See, in level one, we make the rather ignorant assumption that if we just get rid of the bad guys, then only good guys will be left and the world will go happily on ever after. And this is the whole basis of wars and all that. Get rid of the bad guys. And usually we decide who the bad guys are, whoever it is that is different than us usually, or whoever's profoundly incompetent. I think we'd all agree that auto mechanics that send cars out on the road without any brakes and cause endless fatalities are not good practices. So if we get rid of those auto mechanics and only have the good auto mechanics left, less people will die. Probably true. But here's the second level of accountability. And so in this area, we're enemies, right? I want high to shut down or clean up its act. One or the other, right? High wants to pretend there's nothing going on. High facilitators can fuck anyone they want under the influence, blah, 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 and we're going to stand by our own, and this is not a high issue, blah, 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 blah. Ann Watts even said that I seduced Peter Sandhill while I was under the influence of psychedelics, as if somehow when you push a client to have 3 times the amount of psychedelics that they want to take, push them repeatedly, and then add to it. Let's not just do your first psychedelic experience. No. Let's not just triple the dose of psilocybin. No. That's not enough. Let's add another MDMA. Let's add more. And then let's suggest this and push this and do this. And then, lo and behold, the client behaves atypically, meaning they're not themselves. They do something unusual. Well, let's blame the client. In other words, let's pour gin down 5 or 6 facilitators until they can't function, and then blame them for everything that they do under the influence that is not at all normal, having convinced them that the gin is water and for their own good and all that. This is an absolute absurdity. But this was Anne's comment, listening to the tape and stuff, was, "You seduced Peter Sandhill." Well, my goodness, I should apologize. And so and this blaming the client is just one more way. Oh my goodness, I shouldn't have been stoned when my therapist forced me repeatedly and then pledged. Peter made a promise that no man or no adult, no one has ever made a promise like when Peter did. He said he was going to take a rock-solid stand for my well-being if I took this high dose. Like Gandalf on the pass of Carathras. You shall not pass, And this is reassuring. I mean, it's like I almost wanted to take the high dose just so that I could experience one adult taking that kind of a stand for me once in my life in a world of grown-up children who crumble in the face of truth or anything substantive. I mean, just to see an adult in action would be worth risking my life. And then of course he lied before even entering because he hadn't told his wife. He hadn't come in with a solid container. He'd breached the container before arrival, and he didn't announce that until an hour into the session. And all number of things. So, this dynamic of friendship, though, at level 2, it's not about the people involved. Meaning our cult produces emotionally illiterate, sociopathic, chauvinistic, traumatically illiterate, psychologically illiterate human beings. Men, a little bit more than women, because we shame men for being affectionate to one another, so they could learn some more of those skills intuitively if they were really affectionate with other men, but we've told them that we're going to shame them and perhaps kill them, but certainly dehumanize and devalue them if they're affectionate with other men. And so having established that, we now have a slightly lower level of emotional literacy for men than for women. And this is a cult phenomena. This is a cult protocol. There are no bad guys on this level of the problem. The cult is a sick, irrational cult that needs to be changed. Now, this is why I've addressed the issue systemically. I don't really care who the facilitators are or are not, or who the board members are or are not, or if high continues or not. What I care about are the underlying system dynamics. If those change, they will bring out healthy behavior in the individuals playing the roles. If they do not change, getting rid of Peter Sandhill is a complete joke. Peter Sandhill was chosen by the same people who chose the other facilitators. He was trained in the same way the other facilitators were trained, which means the protocol doesn't work because not one facilitator expressed reservations in Peter Sandhill or in themselves. So why would you conclude that the same people who picked Peter Sandhill, who has caused more harm and damage on a number of levels than any person in my entire life, would suddenly use the exact same protocol and not pick a sexual predator the next time? It's the same conundrum with me. Why would I assume that if I picked high as my primary source for love and belonging, and that if I hired 4 of the people who ganged up to protect my abuser and reenact my abuse contract, why would I conclude that this brain is capable of picking a good therapist? It doesn't make any sense. On this level, everyone in this cult has a default mode that is sick in multiple arenas, that harms them and everyone else in multiple arenas. The default mode ensures that. Now, within any interaction, there is a polarity. There's a giver and there's a receiver. There's a client and there's a professional. There's an abuse survivor and an abuser. But the system determines the probability field of all of that. Meaning, if you're really dumb, you send 100 friends to Vegas, and one of them is going to come back with more money, and 99 are going to come back with no or less money. You're going to send 100 friends to Vegas to invest their money, right? And one comes back. And you say, why didn't all the rest of you make money like this one? He made money, why didn't you? This is stupidity in action. And this is what we do with, like, you're going to Yale. Why doesn't my black boy in a slum, why don't you end up in Yale? Well, you see, the probability field of being black, male in a slum is very different from the probability field of being named a Rockefeller in upstate New York going to Yale. Very different probability fields. And it is shaming and a profound ignorance to ask one's probability field to magically become the other. It is a cult phenomena. If we give a damn about ourselves, we will stop some of our racism. If we hate ourselves, we will continue to project our shadow onto a race and pretend we're better than Hitler, right? We don't kill 6 million Jews in furnaces. We just humiliate them, shame them, make them feel like second-class citizens, put them in jail, humiliate them again, break up their families. That's how we torture our projected enemies. So in this level, it's the system. Meaning, you could blame 99 people for ending up poorer after their time in Vegas, or you could make a few changes to the Vegas system. You could just change the house win-lose ratio as set in all the gambling houses, about 10%. Now, if you changed it from 55% of the time the house wins and 45% of the time the player wins, to 55% of the time the player wins and 45% of the time the house loses, or the house loses or wins 45% and loses 55%, you send the same 100 people into that probability field. And now it's just a few people who lost money. Most of them, if they place 100 bets, will come back with more money. Maybe 99% of them. If you place enough bets, that just ensures guaranteed victory in the end. And then you could again say, wow, you're all winners. No, it's the system that's changed. It's the probability field. Now, you can say to someone going to a high workshop with no knowledge of trauma, with no knowledge of how to handle an addict when 1 in 7 Americans are addicts, with no particular knowledge of the human shadow or how to deal with it, with no sense of the cult's suppressed, denied history living through the family abuse systems. And you roll the dice and you throw them all in and escalate the average person's sexuality 500%. And some of them are going to luck out. My goodness, I didn't end up with an addict, so the fact that High didn't talk about addiction or anything doesn't matter. surprise, surprise, I picked one of the 5% of Americans who doesn't have regressed, repressed trauma that they don't know what to do with. So I'm not dealing with someone who goes crazy every now and again. Surprise, surprise, we both wanted the same thing. We didn't traumatize each other emotionally out of sheer dumb luck. And here we have a winner. And we could say to everyone else, well, why don't you be like that? But the really important thing is shifting the house. Because if we talk about insecure attachment disorder, if we talk about sensitivity, if we talk about love languages, if we talk about trauma, traumatic symptoms and how to repair it, if we talk about licensing and caveats and which facilitators are good at what and which are not, if facilitator reviews are made public as a matter of course of what's good for the facilitator and and the client, everyone wins when accurate information is available, that educated choices can be made. And when the facilitators, of course, that are getting crappy reviews in a certain area either don't take on someone that needs traumatic help and refer them to a competent person, or clean up their act so they can get better reviews, etc. Now you've changed the house. Now you've got a community that is trauma literate. Now you've got a community that knows the percentages of sexual abuse within the community, how they happen, and what to do about it. You can have, when you have a book that goes over the 40,000 people who've gone through high, and the facilitator, some of whom have witnessed a great deal of that, covers, this is where we know what we're doing, this is where we have no idea. Every year I run into someone that got fucked up at high and is paying me thousands of dollars and doesn't get any better. And I just take their money and then they drop off the face of the earth and we don't follow up. How about that for some data to share with the community? See, now you're changing the house. And as I say, I don't care who's in the roles. You see, in the play of Romeo and Juliet, whoever is Juliet is going to end up heartbroken, or the Jack the Ripper play. Whoever is the victim of Jack the Ripper, it doesn't matter who's playing the role. If you're, okay, we need 6 people, we're putting on the Jack the Ripper play. We need 7 women to be murdered. Who wants to be a murdered woman? There will be 7 women murdered in a Jack the Ripper performance. That's what the script calls for. There will be 1 in 7 American addicts. That's what our cult script calls for. There will be X amount of porn addiction and this and that. That's what the script calls for. The question is, how do we respond to something with such atrocious statistics when we don't even acknowledge that it's happening, let alone educate people on the best scientific protocols of how to respond? When we don't even acknowledge as teachers that we don't know what we're doing. See, here is, you have the chance to compete, to draw out the best with a challenge. And in this area, I am the friend of the mission. And as Edward Snowden pointed out, when he became the most wanted man in America, according to the Obama administration, he didn't swear an oath to protect the crimes of his superiors. He swore an oath to the Constitution. That's the equivalent, by the way, of the high mission statement. He swore an oath to the Constitution. And his superiors were violating the US Constitution right and left under his nose, and were complicit to a degree that he knew that going to his superiors would get him fired, demoted, silenced, killed, etc. That the only way forward was to bring the violation to the people who were being violated, which made him the #1 enemy. Senator Biden, Vice President Biden, was so frightened of Edward Snowden's truth about the U.S. abuse protocol and violations of its Constitution that he intimidated countries all around the world, personally calling people, and what he basically said to just about every government he called was, there will be consequences. We're not going to tell you what they are, fear of the unknown. Let's intimidate you. We're not going to tell you what there are, but there will be consequences to your country for the worse if you help or give political asylum to Edward Snowden. Thank you. This is the Vice President of the United States. Next call. Now, they broke the law. Diplomats have immunity. They grounded a plane with a diplomat on, against the diplomat's will, to search for Edward Snowden on the case. So laws right and left. And so you, of course, have the facilitators doing the same thing. It's an echo pattern. The power dynamics of a cult echo down to the smaller and smaller level, all the way down to the human ego, where there's some shithole, fear-based, shame-based dictator inside your and my brain that when our fear gets triggered, dominates the shit out of our own lives and terrorizes healthy, logical, rational parts of our psyche out of terror, and just dominates the hell out of us, forces us to break our own guidelines. That's the fractal nature of a cult's consciousness. Down to the human ego, up to the family, up to the community, up to the presidency and the government. That pattern that is the default for each one of us doesn't change unless we change the underlying variables. It doesn't change by knocking. Everyone loves to fire a bad guy, right? Get rid of that president. Oh, right. And the next one is going to be so much, more intelligent at getting things done in a system that is designed to make presidents fail. Give it a shot. I've analyzed the dynamics. It's one of the most unkind things you could possibly want for someone. Be the president of the United States. Have half the country hating you for all the wrong reasons, and be set up to know very little about anything as you're hustled around and pilloried under the glare of every spotlight in town. Was going to discuss everything but the important facts, and know that if you tell the truth to the people, which is that you don't know what the fuck you're doing and you feel overwhelmed and all this, that you will be pilloried again, because we don't want to hear the truth from our leaders. We want to hear something that makes us feel comfortable, something like our dogma. And so this really, we are friends. We are friends in a fucked up system, in roles that are not ideal for either one of us. Your role is, you're the cynical critic, right? Your job is to sit, listen to all this, and come up with several things that you are very clear you're not going to stand for as a good American. And you're going to disrupt and throw everything out and not think, so that you don't have to think about the rest of it. That's your job as an American trying to get rid of information overload. And maybe you're doing a good job of it, maybe you're not. Maybe you've let in a few insights that are going to have to change your life. How inconvenient. But that's your role, is to be the righteous critic who no one's going to tell what to do and all that. And it's bullshit. It doesn't lead anywhere. The entire community stood by as the entire framework of High's mission, safety, legal right to exist was torn to shreds and did nothing. You call that a competent community? No, it's dysfunctional. It's abusive. It's pathetic, as the role is defined, which is, it's not my problem, it's not my problem, it's not. Well, it wasn't Peter's problem either. Apparently, In our cult, the only person's problem it is if you get raped or fucked over by an abusive power cult is your problem, because nobody else is going to do a goddamn thing about it. And this is sick. It breeds abuse. The system has to change. Now, if you understand that this is your system until you change it, we're not talking about me, we're not talking about Peter, then this information is your friend.